The strategic situation map displayed in the conference room at the Berghof showed German-occupied Europe at its maximum extent, stretching from the Atlantic coast of France to the outskirts of Moscow, from Norway's Arctic Circle to the deserts of North Africa. It was early 1944, and Adolf Hitler stood before this map with Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, discussing the defensive preparations for the inevitable Allied invasion from Britain that everyone knew was coming, though no one could predict with certainty when or where it would strike. What should have been a meeting focused with laser intensity on the existential threat of Anglo-American forces establishing a second major front in Western Europe instead devolved into Hitler's familiar patterns of dismissal, distraction, and delusional confidence that the Atlantic Wall would hold, that any invasion could be thrown back into the sea, that the real war remained in the East against the Soviets. This systematic underestimation of the Second Front's threat, this refusal to treat the coming invasion as the potential catastrophe it represented, stemmed from multiple layers of strategic misjudgment, ideological prejudice, and psychological inability to accept that Germany faced enemies on multiple fronts who possessed resources and capabilities that made German defensive options increasingly futile. Hitler's dismissal of the Second Front threat began with his fundamental assessment of the Western Allies as militarily inferior to German forces. This judgment was rooted partly in the 1940 campaign in France, where the wehrmacht had defeated the combined French and British armies in 6 weeks of fighting that demonstrated German operational and tactical superiority. The memory of that victory, achieved against opponents who on paper possessed numerical equality or slight advantage, convinced Hitler that German forces were qualitatively superior to Western armies, that even if outnumbered or outgunned, German tactical excellence and fighting spirit would prevail in any defensive battle. This assessment ignored crucial differences between 1940 and 1944 that should have been obvious to any strategic thinker willing to examine evidence objectively. The British Army of 1944 was not the force that had been evacuated from Dunkirk. It was better equipped, better trained, and led by commanders who had learned from early war failures. The American forces preparing for invasion had evolved dramatically from the inexperienced troops who had struggled in North Africa. They had gained combat experience in Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy, had developed tactical proficiency through hard lessons, and possessed material advantages that grew more overwhelming with each passing month. Most fundamentally, the combined Anglo-American force would attack with resources in men, equipment, and logistical support that dwarfed anything available in 1940. Supported by air and naval superiority so complete that German forces would be fighting under conditions completely different from the offensive campaigns that had characterized earlier victories. Hitler's confidence in the Atlantic Wall represented another dimension of his underestimation. He had ordered the construction of coastal fortifications stretching from Norway to Spain, a defensive system that propaganda portrayed as impregnable, capable of stopping any invasion attempt through fixed fortifications that would destroy landing forces on the beaches. Hitler believed in the wall's effectiveness with a faith that was part genuine conviction and part willful self-deception. The bunkers and obstacles and gun positions represented tangible defensive preparations, physical manifestations of German engineering that aligned with Hitler's preference for concrete solutions to strategic problems. But Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, appointed to command Army Group B and responsible for defending the likely invasion sectors, understood that the Atlantic Wall was far from complete, and that even where fortifications existed, they could not prevent a determined invasion backed by overwhelming force. Rommel had inspected the coastal defenses and found them inadequate. Gaps in coverage, insufficient obstacles, defensive positions that could be bypassed or reduced by naval gunfire and air bombardment. He had ordered intensified construction efforts, millions of mines laid, obstacles placed on beaches, but he recognized these were improvements to defenses that remained fundamentally insufficient against the invasion force being assembled in Britain. The debate between Rommel and von Rundstedt about defensive strategy revealed deeper problems with German preparation for the Second Front. Rommel argued for defeating the invasion on the beaches, throwing everything into forward defense because Allied air superiority would prevent German reserves from reaching the coast once invasion began. Von Rundstedt advocated holding armor in reserve for counterattack once the main landing sites were identified, following traditional German doctrine of mobile defense. Hitler characteristically split the difference in ways that satisfied neither commander. Some forces would be held forward, others in reserve, but the reserves would be under Hitler's personal control and could not be committed without his authorization. This command structure virtually guaranteed that German response to invasion would be slow and confused. When the Normandy landings began on June 6, 1944, the panzer reserves that might have counterattacked were held back because Hitler was sleeping and staff officers were reluctant to wake him with news of what might be a feint rather than the main invasion. By the time authorization came to move reserves toward Normandy, Allied air power had made daylight movement suicidal, and hours had been lost that might have been crucial in the narrow window when beachheads were most vulnerable. But the command failures on D-Day were symptoms of Hitler's broader failure to treat the Second Front threat with appropriate seriousness. Throughout late 1943 and early 1944, as intelligence reports documented the massive buildup of Allied forces in Britain, Hitler continued to prioritize the Eastern Front over Western defense. The best divisions, the newest equipment, the bulk of German military resources went to fighting the Soviets, while the forces assigned to defend France were often second-rate formations, static divisions without transport, divisions rebuilt after Eastern Front disasters with inadequate replacements. This resource allocation reflected Hitler's strategic priorities and his assessment of where the decisive battles would be fought. He understood that the Soviet Union represented an existential threat, that Soviet armies had to be stopped or they would drive into Germany itself. The Second Front, by contrast, seemed to Hitler like a problem that could be managed. The invasion would come, would be contested at the beaches, would be defeated, or at least contained through competent defensive operations. He convinced himself that the Western Allies lacked the stomach for the kind of casualties that serious campaigning would require, that early setbacks would lead to political pressure for negotiated settlement, that the fundamental weakness he attributed to democracies would manifest once the fighting became difficult. This assessment catastrophically misjudged both Allied military capabilities and political determination. The Allied nations had spent years preparing for the Second Front, had invested enormous resources in building invasion forces, had developed amphibious warfare into a systematic capability refined through operations in the Mediterranean. The political leadership, Churchill in Britain, Roosevelt in America, had committed themselves publicly to Germany's unconditional surrender and could not retreat from this position without political catastrophe. The populations of both nations, after years of war and substantial casualties already suffered, were grimly determined to see the conflict through to complete victory. Hitler's ideological framework also contributed to his underestimation of the Second Front threat. His racial theories taught that mongrel democracies like America and class-divided societies like Britain could not sustain the unity and determination necessary for prolonged warfare. These beliefs, which had no basis in reality, but which Hitler had convinced himself were fundamental truths, led him to expect that Allied cohesion would fracture under pressure, that political opposition to the war would grow as casualties mounted, that divisions between American and British forces would create coordination problems that German defenders could exploit. The actual Allied performance, unprecedented cooperation between American and British forces, subordination of national interest to combined strategic planning, maintenance of political unity despite substantial casualties, contradicted everything Hitler's ideology predicted. But rather than acknowledging that his racial theories were wrong, Hitler attributed Allied success to temporary factors or dismissed it as impossible to sustain. The Second Front could not really be as dangerous as it appeared, because the forces creating it were racially and politically inferior, incapable of the sustained excellence that defeating Germany would require. The intelligence available to Hitler about Allied invasion preparations should have dispelled any complacency about the Second Front's threat. German reconnaissance aircraft and agents reported the massive concentration of forces in southern England, armies being assembled, equipment stockpiled, training exercises conducted. The numbers were staggering, millions of soldiers being prepared for invasion, thousands of landing craft being constructed, supplies accumulated for sustaining armies after they came ashore. This build-up was visible and undeniable, documented in reports that reached German headquarters regularly. But Hitler convinced himself, or allowed his staff to convince him, that the visible preparations were partly deception, that the real invasion might come somewhere other than where Allied activity was concentrated, that German defensive preparations were adequate to meet the threat. He seized on intelligence about Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception plan suggesting that Normandy landings would be followed by a larger invasion at Pas-de-Calais, and used this to justify holding reserves away from Normandy even after the invasion began. The deception worked brilliantly, partly because Hitler wanted to believe it, wanted to think that he had outguessed the Allies, wanted to maintain reserves for the real invasion that would validate his strategic judgment. The resource commitments required to defend against a serious Second Front threat were resources that Hitler was unwilling to divert from the Eastern Front. Defending France properly would require the best divisions, adequate air support, mobile reserves with fuel to move them, coastal fortifications completed and properly garrisoned. Each of these requirements competed with Eastern Front needs, where German forces were already stretched thin, trying to hold against Soviet offensives. Hitler's allocation decisions consistently prioritized the East over the West, convinced that the Soviets represented the immediate danger, while the Second Front was a future problem that could be addressed when it materialized. This sequential thinking, deal with the Soviets now, handle the invasion later, failed to account for the strategic reality that both fronts would be active simultaneously, that Allied invasion was being timed to coincide with Soviet offensives specifically to prevent Germany from concentrating forces against either threat. The coordination between Western Allies and Soviets, which Hitler had predicted would be impossible due to ideological differences, functioned effectively enough to ensure that Germany faced maximum pressure from multiple directions, that success on one front could not be achieved by weakening another. The German generals who understood the Second Front's potential danger were constrained by Hitler's command structure and their own limited authority to redirect resources. Rommel's desperate efforts to improve coastal defenses were hampered by labor shortages, material scarcity, and the fact that the best units and equipment continued flowing to the Eastern Front. Von Rundstedt's attempts to establish meaningful operational reserves were frustrated by Hitler's insistence on personal control over armor deployments. The commanders who would be responsible for defeating the invasion lacked the resources and authority to prepare adequately because Hitler refused to treat the threat as the strategic priority it deserved. The success of Allied deception operations contributed to Hitler's complacency about the Second Front. Operation Bodyguard, the overall deception plan, and its subsidiary operations created false impressions about invasion timing, location, and scale. German intelligence was fed information suggesting invasions might target Norway or the Balkans, or multiple locations simultaneously. These deceptions, reinforced by fake radio traffic and false agent reports, created enough uncertainty to prevent German forces from concentrating preparations on Normandy specifically. But the deceptions worked so effectively partly because they aligned with what Hitler wanted to believe. He wanted to think the invasion might strike Norway, because it validated his concerns about Scandinavian defences. He wanted to believe Pas-de-Calais might be the main target, because it was the shortest channel crossing and seemed like the obvious choice. He wanted to accept intelligence suggesting Allied forces were more numerous than they actually were, because it justified holding larger reserves for the real invasion. The deception plans exploited Hitler's biases and his tendency to see what his theories predicted rather than what evidence demonstrated. The actual Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944, validated every concern that realistic assessments of the Second Front threat had raised. Allied forces landed in overwhelming strength, supported by naval gunfire that destroyed defensive positions and by air superiority so complete that German forces could barely contest Allied control of the skies. The amphibious operations were executed with professional competence that reflected years of preparation and refinement of doctrine. The logistics that sustained Allied forces, bringing supplies across the beaches, then through temporary ports, supporting armies that grew larger daily, demonstrated organizational capabilities that German planning had not adequately accounted for. The initial German response was hampered by all the command and resource problems that inadequate preparation had created. The panzer reserves were held back, awaiting Hitler's authorization, losing crucial hours. The Luftwaffe could barely contest Allied air superiority, having been bled white by years of combat and the priority given to defending Germany against strategic bombing. The coastal divisions fought with varying effectiveness, but were ultimately overwhelmed by the weight of Allied assault. Within days, the Allies had established beachheads that could not be eliminated, had linked separate landing zones into continuous fronts, and were building up forces faster than German reinforcements could arrive. Hitler's response to the invasion's success revealed his continued inability to accept the Second Front's strategic significance. He continued to believe Normandy was a feint, that the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, that Allied forces could still be defeated through determined counterattack. He ordered offensives by forces that lacked the strength to execute them, demanded that every meter of ground be held when mobile defense might have been more effective, refused to authorize strategic withdrawals that might have preserved forces for defense of more critical terrain. The Battle of Normandy became a grinding attrition campaign that progressively destroyed German forces in France. Allied material superiority in artillery, armor, air support, logistics made every engagement costly for German defenders. The bocage terrain that initially favored defense eventually became a trap as Allied forces developed tactics to overcome it, while German forces lacked the mobility to conduct the kind of fighting withdrawal that might have preserved their strength. By late July, when American forces achieved breakthrough at St. Lo and began Operation Cobra, the mobile warfare at which the Wehrmacht had once excelled was being executed by enemies who possessed the resources and tactical competence to exploit success, while German forces fought desperately to avoid encirclement. The Falaise Pocket in August, where German forces attempting to withdraw from Normandy were trapped and largely destroyed, represented the catastrophic culmination of Hitler's failure to take the Second Front seriously. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured, thousands of vehicles and hundreds of tanks were destroyed or abandoned, entire divisions ceased to exist as organized formations. The losses were comparable to those suffered in the East, but were inflicted in a theater Hitler had believed could be defended with secondary forces through competent tactical operations. The broader strategic implications of the Second Front's success extended beyond the immediate losses in France. With Allied forces established in Western Europe, Germany now fought a true multi-front war against enemies possessing overwhelming material superiority on every front. The forces sent to defend France were forces unavailable for the East, where Soviet summer offensives were destroying Army Group Center. The resources consumed in futile counterattacks in Normandy were resources that might have strengthened defenses elsewhere. The psychological impact of losing France, of seeing Allied forces advance toward Germany from the west, while Soviets advanced from the east, accelerated the deterioration of German morale and the recognition among military professionals that the war was lost. Hitler's systematic underestimation of the Second Front threat was thus not a single error, but a pattern of misjudgments rooted in ideology, shaped by memories of past success, reinforced by deception operations, and sustained by refusal to adjust assessments when evidence contradicted assumptions. He had convinced himself that Western allies were militarily inferior, that the Atlantic Wall would stop invasion, that command structure splitting authority between commanders served German interests, that resources were better spent fighting Soviets than preparing Western defenses, that Allied unity would fracture under pressure, that deception intelligence about Pas-de-Calais represented German cleverness rather than Allied manipulation. Each of these judgments was wrong, and collectively they ensured that when the Second Front opened at Normandy, German forces were inadequately prepared, poorly positioned, insufficiently resourced, and commanded through a structure that prevented effective response. The invasion succeeded not merely because Allied forces were materially superior, though they were, but because Hitler had refused to treat the threat with the seriousness it deserved, had allocated resources as though the Second Front was a manageable problem rather than a potential catastrophe, had allowed himself to be deceived because the deceptions aligned with what he wanted to believe. The final irony was that Hitler had always feared a two-front war, had structured his early war strategy specifically to avoid fighting Britain and the Soviet Union simultaneously. Yet through his own decisions, declaring war on America after Pearl Harbor, failing to defeat Britain before attacking the Soviet Union, refusing to negotiate settlement with either East or West, he had created exactly the strategic situation he most feared. And when that two-front war materialized with the Normandy invasion, he faced it with forces and resources inadequate to prevent defeat on either front, having ignored the Second Front's threat until it was too late to prepare adequately. The Second Front that opened in June 1944 would drive relentlessly toward Germany through the remainder of the year and into 1945, liberating France and the Low Countries, crossing the Rhine, meeting Soviet forces advancing from the east, somewhere in the ruins of the Third Reich. Hitler's failure to take this threat seriously, to prepare adequately, to allocate resources appropriately, to command effectively, ensured that the Second Front he had dismissed as manageable became the instrument of Germany's destruction in the West, complementing Soviet victories in the East, together crushing the regime that had ignored threats it could not afford to underestimate until those threats made German defeat inevitable and total.